They knew they were going to die. That wasn't the question. The question was how long they could hold out, how many of the enemy they could take with them, and whether the world would remember what they did behind those crumbling stone walls in San Antonio. Because what stood at the Alamo in March of 1836 wasn't an army. It was a collection of farmers, blacksmiths, printers, and wanderers. Some had come for glory, others for land, and some just because they had nowhere else to go. But by the time the sky darkened with cannon smoke and the walls shook with gunfire, they stood together as one. Outnumbered nearly 10-1. Surrounded. And yet, they stayed. The year before, few Americans had even heard the name Alamo. It was an old Spanish mission, abandoned years earlier and slowly falling into ruin. But in the struggle for Texas, it became a symbol, first of defiance, then of sacrifice. Texas was part of Mexico, but that Mexico was changing fast. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had seized power and declared himself dictator. He scrapped the Constitution, disbanded local governments, and sent armies to crush resistance. Many Mexican citizens, especially those in the northern provinces like Texas, saw him for what he was, a tyrant. Settlers in Texas had already begun to rebel. At first, it was about self-rule, autonomy, but as Santa Anna tightened his grip, independence became the only option. In December 1835, a ragtag Texian militia stormed San Antonio and seized the Alamo from a small Mexican garrison. They dug in, reinforced the walls, positioned cannons where they could. It wasn't much, but it was something. That's when the letters began. Urgent, pleading, desperate, calling for help, for supplies, for men. Travis wrote to Sam Houston. Crockett wrote to Tennessee. One letter after another crossed the plains. But reinforcements were slow. The Alamo was far from the major settlements, and many feared marching straight into Santa Anna's army. Still, some answered. Davy Crockett rode in with a few volunteers, rifle slung across his back, tall and rough around the edges. James Butler Bonham arrived soon after, ignoring the danger. These weren't soldiers. They were men willing to die for something they believed in, even if they weren't sure what that was just yet. Inside the Alamo, command was uneasy. Officially, it belonged to William Barrett Travis, a young officer with more resolve than experience. But James Bowie, bedridden with illness, still carried weight. He was a fighter, feared and respected. The men didn't care much about rank. They cared about courage, and soon they'd all need every ounce of it. On February 23, 1836, the first Mexican troops appeared on the horizon. At first, they seemed like scouts. Then came the cavalry, the infantry, artillery, thousands of soldiers, drums pounded, banners unfurled. And then came the general himself, Santa Anna, riding tall, gold braid on his uniform, confident and cruel. He expected a surrender. He expected submission. What he got was a cannon shot. Travis's answer to the demand for surrender wasn't a reply. It was fire. The siege began. The defenders knew their odds, but they also knew what failure meant. Santa Anna was known for his brutality. When he'd crushed another rebellion in Zacatecas, he'd allowed his men to loot and slaughter. He didn't take prisoners. He took lives. The Alamo had to hold. For 12 days, the Mexican army pounded the walls, day and night. The air shook with every blast. The chapel shook with every strike. Stones split. Dust filled lungs. The defenders patched what they could, rolled cannonballs back into position, and waited. They passed the time by writing letters, some to loved ones, some to no one at all. One man carved a message into the handle of his knife. Another scribbled a final letter and tucked it into the wall, hoping someone might one day find it. Outside the walls, the enemy massed. Santa Anna had brought more than soldiers. He brought order and spectacle. He held parades, issued proclamations. He promised his men the spoils of victory and reminded them daily that inside the Alamo were traitors to the Republic. But inside those walls, something strange happened. A kind of calm, a resolve. These weren't fanatics. They were men who had simply decided they'd rather die standing than run. On the night of March 5th, Travis called his men together. He explained what would happen in the morning. The attack would come before dawn. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. He drew a line in the sand with his sword. Legend says he offered every man the choice: cross it and stay, or walk away. Almost every man stepped over. And so, just before dawn on March 6th, 1836, the final assault began. It started in silence, then drums. Then the first wave of Mexican soldiers charged the north wall. Cannons from inside the Alamo roared. Grape shot and musket fire tore through the first ranks, but they kept coming. Ladders went up. Some fell, others climbed. Men fought hand to hand at the top. Bayonets met rifle stocks. Knives met flesh. Blood stained the stone. A second wave hit the east wall. Then, the west. Soon the defenders couldn't hold the lines. The walls were breached. Mexican soldiers poured into the courtyard. The defenders fell back to the chapel and barracks. Inside, the fight became chaos. Close, brutal, savage. Men reloading in corners. Others swinging rifles like clubs. Some were shot point blank. Others stabbed where they stood. Travis was shot through the head early in the fighting. Bowie, still weak from illness, fired pistols from his cot until they bayoneted him where he lay. Crockett's death is still debated. Some say he died with his rifle in hand. Others claim he was captured alive and executed by Santa Anna hours later. The truth may never be known, but what's certain, he never left the Alamo alive. By 8 a.m., it was over. Santa Anna ordered the bodies of the defenders burned. No burials, no honors, just ash and smoke. He considered it justice, but he didn't realize what he'd done. He hadn't just crushed a rebellion, he'd lit a fire. The massacre at the Alamo became a rallying cry. Across Texas, men who had wavered now took up arms. Remember the Alamo was scrawled onto rifles, whispered in camps, and shouted in battle. It meant no mercy, no surrender, no forgetting. And just 6 weeks later, at the Battle of San Jacinto, that cry would rise again, just before Santa Anna's army was destroyed in 18 minutes. Texas would win its independence. The Alamo would never be rebuilt. It would become a shrine, a scar, a story. People would come from all over the world to walk its grounds, touch its walls, wonder what kind of men stood there and chose to fight anyway. They weren't saints. They weren't supermen. They were stubborn, brave, and doomed. And they made their stand not because they thought they could win, but because they believed something mattered more than survival. That freedom was worth dying for. That courage meant holding your ground, even when you know you're going to fall. And fall they did, but they made history echo. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.